Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fergus Hanson, one of the two research directors here at ASPI. And thank you all for taking the time this afternoon to join us for the launch of this very timely report by ASPI Fellow Rajiv Shah. And let me also begin by thanking Macquarie Government for generously supporting this research. We've had a long-standing partnership with Macquarie, and one of the hallmarks of the partnership that most impresses me is their enduring commitment to participating in, spurring and engaging in policy discussions that try and help Australia do public policy better. So thank you, Aidan, and thank you to Macquarie for supporting us with this work. We're very honoured to hopefully be having the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology, Karen Andrews, join us today to launch this report. We're just working through a few last-minute technical issues to get her online, but hopefully she will be joining us very shortly. If not, we will be pivoting seamlessly into a Plan B strategy. The supply chain disruptions that have been brought about by the COVID-19 crisis have created a rare window where our national approach to industry, science and technology can be reappraised. And the crisis has opened up the opportunity for big changes and new thinking. Minister Andrews has been leading that discussion nationally, so we're really pleased to be able to have you join us, Minister. And at the International Cyber Policy Centre, we're dedicated to original empirical research that attempts to improve public policy and we hope provides government and industry with new ideas for doing things better. Before I hand over to the Minister, a short note on the format for today. After the Minister speaks, she's kindly agreed to take a few questions before we turn to our expert panel. And we've got with us today Aidan Tudehope, the Director of Macquarie Government, Michelle Price, the CEO of AustCyber, and Rajiv Shah, a Fellow at the International Cyber Policy Centre. There will also be an opportunity for questions. You'll see in the right-hand side a questions tab. If you click there and submit your questions, and you can upvote, and I don't think you can downvote, but you can at least upvote others' questions. I'll be very happy to field as many of them as I can. The report we're launching today traverses the intersection of industry and government, and it would be hard to think of a better person to launch it. Not only do we have a cabinet minister, launching it, we have a mechanical engineer and someone who has run their own business and knows what it takes to set up a successful Australian firm. Minister, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today, and I'm very honoured to hand over the floor to you.
It's a pleasure, and thank you very much for having me with you today. Now, I'm hoping you can hear me. Excellent, excellent. So I welcome which looks at how Australian governments, as the largest procurers of ICT nationwide, can drive improved cybersecurity, more secure supply chains, and build local industry. In 2018-19, there were over 78,000 contracts published on AusTender, with a combined value of over $64 billion. The report identifies the challenges and barriers to effective government ICT supply chain security and suggests solutions which encourage suppliers to increase their security and more even access to the market for Australian suppliers. Recommendations to support this include a sovereign capability framework to identify which technologies are strategically important to develop locally, mandating procurement and investment, which would signal to industry those areas in which to prioritise research and development. Now, COVID-19 has only exacerbated the risks of cyber attacks as many businesses move to a digital environment, with employees working from home and businesses moving online to sell their goods and services. The importance of cybersecurity and consideration of how to lift our national cybersecurity have never been greater. Procurement is an immediately available economic lever for government to support our efforts to grow Australia's cybersecurity business and signal the need for and build a higher level of national resilience. The Australian Government has strong rules around procurement to ensure we are non-discriminatory and meet our international legal and trade obligations. My view is that we should be using all our levers to build Australian capability and bolster supply chains. I'm particularly interested in building our sovereign capability, and am pleased to see the report encourages this as a priority for the cybersecurity sector. A key initiative that I've supported is the Australian Cybersecurity Growth Network, AustCyber, established as part of the 2016 Cybersecurity Strategy and part of the Industry Growth Centres initiative. And it's great to see Michelle Price here, the CEO of AustCyber, presenting and speaking on the panel. AustCyber is a $40.5 million public-private partnership created to ensure Australia is positioned to take advantage of the growing global cybersecurity market and support the development of a strong sovereign cybersecurity industry. My portfolio also includes the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre, the CRC, a collaboration between industry, government and the research sector that has leveraged $50 million in Commonwealth Government funding. The CRC aims to grow Australia's capability in cybersecurity, research, development and commercialisation, and delivering solutions that ensure Australians and Australian businesses remain safe online. AustCyber's Digital Trust Report 2020 shows that cybersecurity contributes over $15 billion in revenues and over 92,000 jobs to the Australian economy, underpinning the trust held in over $1 trillion in economic output per year from digital activity. Growing, supporting and maturing Australia's sovereign cybersecurity is now more critical than ever as the digital threat landscape accelerates and business, government and the community need to be increasingly on their guard to protect themselves from malicious activities. Earlier this month, our government launched the 2020 Cybersecurity Strategy, and I'm pleased to be delivering on our election commitment to build the cybersecurity workforce for the future as part of that strategy. I'll be delivering a cybersecurity career pathways program of work to address the critical need for over 17,000 additional cyber professionals across the economy to 2026 and beyond. I'm keen to continue to tackle the difficult task of uplifting our SME cybersecurity resilience. Through my Cybersecurity Connect and Protect program, the Australian Government will arm trusted advisors with the ability to directly influence, provide education and support improvements in SME capabilities against cyber attack. So it's with great pleasure that I launch this report today and support the excellent work of the International Cyber Policy Centre.
Minister, thank you so much for those very generous and thoughtful remarks on Rajiv's paper, and thank you for agreeing to take a few questions. And I know what is a very, very busy time for you. My first question, Minister, pivoting off your remarks around the need for Australia to develop this sovereign capability, and you've obviously been a leading voice in Australia calling for this development of this capability, not just in technology, but more broadly. But in the technology space, how do we, given the urgency of the situation, the COVID-19 crisis, what it's done to Australian business, what it's sort of done to precipitate these discussions about the need for sovereign capability, how do we, what are the steps that we could take today to help Australian sovereign capability to be developed or to support Australian industry in the technology field versus, say, the medium-term policies that will be coming down the pathway, no doubt. And my sort of chaser question to you is, what are your views on the sort of the Buy America Act that they have in the United States, and is there a version of that that would fit in to the Australian landscape that you can see?
Well, I'm actually going to start with the latter part of your question there. Look, I'm a very strong supporter of Australian products and services, and I guess there's two parts to that. One, it is my job to be supporting Australian industry and Australian-made goods and Australian services. But I'm personally very committed to making sure that we do all we can to support Australian-made goods and Australian services. Now, I don't say that in a protectionist capacity. I say that because I do truly believe in Australia's capability, but I also see that it's important for us to develop Australian capability in a number of key areas, not just for what we need now, but so that we can feed into global supply chains. I think it is Australia's time now. We have demonstrated to date through the COVID management processes that we have put in place here that we are an international player that should be considered by many other countries. We are globally seen as a safe pair of hands as a nation, and we are seen clearly as a safe environment in which to work. Now, I'm very much aware that I'm talking to the cybersecurity industry when I talk about safe, but within the contexts of that, I think when you compare the environment in which we live and work here in Australia, it is very different to that in a number of overseas countries. Clearly not without risk, and risk is important for us to be managing. So when I talk about developing industries and developing capability for Australia, it is in that context. Now, we have done a considerable amount of work to look at what our sovereign needs are. And I think it's fair to say that people get really quite anxious when I talk about sovereign needs because they see that as protectionism. I'm not talking protectionism at all. I'm saying very clearly that Australia needs to be able to look after its own needs. We won't be able to deliver everything that we want. We will need the global supply chains for that, and we will need to continue to be a strong export nation. But in terms of our sovereign needs, I've reframed that as sovereign resilience because that doesn't seem to alarm so many people when I talk about sovereign resilience. I think what the important thing for us to do as a government, and this is where we do need the support and the input from industry, is understanding what all of those sovereign needs are that we need to build into our resilience program. So what do we need to do to be able to support ourselves and to protect ourselves? And from a cybersecurity point of view, that is particularly important. Now, I indicated when I was speaking just before that there has been effectively a wholesale move into the digital world courtesy of COVID. There are many businesses that did not have an online presence or had probably a very basic online presence that have needed to move very quickly into the online space. They probably don't have a full grasp and a full understanding of what all the issues are that they need to take into account, not just in terms of their business and how they can sell their goods and services, but how they keep themselves safe and protect against malicious attacks. So I think this is an opportunity for us to look at what we can do to protect businesses here in Australia, and that is clearly an opportunity for industry to input into that and provide advice into government on what the key areas are. Now, I'm conscious I've just talked for a very long time then, but you did get me quite excited about the topic, so bear with me.
No, that's wonderful. Minister, there's also there's been a sort of very involved bureaucratic discussion around the definitions around emerging technology and critical technologies, and other ways to describe different technologies. I was wondering if you have a view on how you define emerging technologies versus critical technologies, and whether you've yet reached the point where you would want to articulate which of those technologies you feel we should be developing sovereign capability in.
Yeah, look, they're actually very good questions, and it's something that I'm certainly very open to taking advice from, particularly from industry. Look, there has been a lot of discussion, and, you know, to be quite frank, I don't know that there is an absolutely clear definition of the emerging technologies and the critical technologies. But this is where government has to be open to taking advice from industry. Now, there's certainly myself as the Industry Minister and the Technology Minister involved in that space too, but we've also had Paul Fletcher as the Communications Minister being very involved in the emerging technologies and also the critical technologies, as we have had Minister Peter Dutton involved in that as well too. But that is something that I would be very keen to hear from industry. And in terms of critical technologies, you know, which are in terms of a hierarchy, what are the priorities? I'm really conscious that as a government, we can't continue to be all things to all people. So when we are looking at critical technologies, when we are looking at emerging technologies, I'm keen to get advice from industry about where they believe their government should be focusing its attentions.
I beg your pardon, I was trying to find my mute button there. Minister, I was going to take a question from one of our audience members, and there was a question around how you can define a sovereign company, given that a company that may be sovereign today potentially isn't going to be sovereign into the future if it's, for example, purchased by a foreign company or a foreign state-owned entity. We've had some changes with the FIRB conditions during the COVID period, but is this something that also plays into your thinking about development of sovereign capability?
Look, it is clearly a part that we need to take into account, and I know that it's something that the Treasurer is very interested in, as is Minister Dutton from Home Affairs, and it is a key issue. However, from a sovereign capability, a sovereign needs perspective, the work that I am doing is dealing with the industry sectors that we need to start looking at, and then we will look at what those technologies will be. The next layer of that is clearly looking at the businesses, what their capabilities are, and of course what their risks are, being conscious of how I'm answering that question. So yes, we need to be very much aware of that without a doubt. There is no easy answer, and it's very right to ask the question, and I'll put it very simply as ownership of a business can change. And we are well aware of where there have been instances where that change has happened at lightning speed, that businesses have come to Australia with a particular setup, and that has changed into an entirely different structure with a different ownership model very quickly. So we have a number of organisations that are involved in looking at those sorts of things. We are particularly aware of it, and we will continue to take all the steps that we can, particularly when we're talking about critical technologies.
And Minister, could I ask you one final question? This is a question that we've got. I'm going to pivot off someone's question around how local SMEs could be incentivised. Now, you're coming up to the inaugural October 6th budget, and we're always interested in getting a scoop at ASPI. I was wondering whether there's any sort of insights you could share about what might be in the pipeline for SMEs or sovereign firms to spur greater sovereign capability, or can we at least have a teaser that there, do you anticipate any sort of interesting announcements in the budget for SMEs and Australian business?
Well, of course, in order to respond to that, I will need to separate myself from the question that you have asked. So let me say this as the final point that I would make. As I have looked at industry capability, I'm very conscious of small enterprises, medium enterprises, and the larger enterprises. Now, Macquarie Cash has responsibility for small businesses. Our work overlaps a lot. A lot of work and a lot of support has been given to small businesses, particularly to support them as they transition to digital. What I am interested in is, of course, supporting our small businesses and understanding what the issues are that approach the large businesses. But I'm particularly interested in medium enterprises and what we can do to scale those operations, because it's important for us to focus some attention on medium enterprises, because if we can scale up medium enterprises, then they will be interested in looking at how they can secure their supply chains, and how they can bring small businesses with them.
Minister, thank you so much for making the time today to be with us. We are very honoured to have you launch this paper, and thank you very much for agreeing to take some questions from ASPI, but also from our audience members. So I'll give you a virtual clap, I'm sure, from everybody. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to join you, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. We're now going to pivot to a conversation with our panel members. We've got Aidan Tudehope, Michelle Price, and Rajiv Shah. Rajiv, given you're the author of this paper, I was going to ask you the first question. The federal government's ICT spend is $10 billion per annum. That, as you note, doesn't include state or territory spends in this area. So that makes government the largest purchaser in this space. Is government leveraging that market power adequately at the moment?
So I think the simple answer is no. And if the simple answer had been yes, it would have been a very short paper to write. But yeah, there are a number of areas, I think, where there is more that can be done. We've heard the cybersecurity strategy getting announced and a lot of initiatives there, but we need to think more broadly. And, as the minister's talked about, government has a role to play in developing this capability, and that spend, that $10 billion a year plus, you could just take a small fraction of it. That could have a huge impact in terms of security. So yes, it's not leveraging it, and there are a number of things to get done to make that better. And, a lot of that's to do with being, firstly, actually having it front and center of mind. And one thing that's interesting to me is that work started on this paper about 6 months ago, before anyone had even heard the word COVID mentioned. And maybe then talking about a sovereign industry capability framework sounded quite radical to some people, but now it's something that's at the forefront of everyone's minds. And we need to make sure, therefore, that gets incorporated in as part of not only the processes, but the culture of how this is approached.
Well, let me take that point about developing this sovereign capability framework and which technologies government should be developing locally, and ask you a question, Aidan. I mean, what is your view about whether this would help, and which technologies you think that should be on that list of priorities for government to develop locally?
I mean, there is no time like now where we need sovereign capabilities. And in fact, we need to be unapologetic. We need to go from, let's call it, very clear messaging from right across government, from the Prime Minister, Minister Roberts, now Minister Andrews, that we need to build up sovereign capabilities, and we need it for jobs, we need it for skills, and that skills part in cybersecurity is crucial, because as we try to harden the nation's assets, the nation's information, including those that are in the custodianship of the government, if we don't have good skills, then we're going to really struggle to continue to raise that posture. So when I think about sovereign capabilities and sovereign skills, there is no area more important than cybersecurity. It's a horizontal theme. It goes across all sectors. And so by setting some clear frameworks that we then embed into government procurement, we provide commercial incentives for Australian businesses and overseas businesses to raise their cybersecurity posture. It is relatively straightforward. The key now is time is against us, particularly in this COVID world.
I think we need to keep going there, Aidan.
Fair enough. I mean, I think one of the challenges, for government is that the Prime Minister has come out clearly that there is a real cybersecurity risk. We've had Minister Robert elevate that sensitive data needs to stay with Australian providers. We've had Minister Andrews elevate just now how important sovereignty is and capabilities here. And I think we just really need to change gears. And we need to work out how we move from more consultation and more consideration. How do we actually embed it right now? Because Australian businesses would really appreciate that $10 billion of IT procurement that is available. And this is not to say that everything can go to Australian providers. That would be completely incorrect. It would certainly have a big job, a big shot in the arm for all Australian providers. We have you back online, Fergus?
Sorry about the ASPI technical glitch. That's nice and ironic for us. It must be many of our friends got a lot of recent activity for and interest in ASPI at the moment. Thank you for carrying on the show without me. Michelle, I was going to pivot to you and ask a question which hopefully hasn't already been answered, but your job at AustCyber is to get Australia's cybersecurity industry humming. Now, there's always the case that you can make that, is cybersecurity a technology that should be a sovereign capability? And how do you get around the argument that this isn't just rent seeking, that there is a genuine need to develop cybersecurity as a sovereign capability?
Well, I don't think that's been answered yet, Fergus, so thank you. Well, of course, I think in the national security side of the parts of the economy that have an understanding of what national security is, and the kinds of horizontals that we have within critical and emerging technologies. Cybersecurity is just such an important part of that sort of family of technologies, but also enables all of those technologies as well. And so to use your words, absolutely, I think we have now proven over the past 4 years, and when I say we, it's the royal we, it's all of the different actors involved on the light side of this equation, that cybersecurity as an industry is not just rent-seeking, that we are now, in terms of the economic ramifications, both in terms of the upside and the downside risks, we are a sector within our own right now. The ABS conception of that just hasn't kind of caught up yet, but it will on the next review of all of the industry coding. I absolutely expect to see cybersecurity there. And so in terms of that sovereignty piece, I think what we have seen also in this same last 4 years, such a significant uptick in the dynamics of geopolitical engagement around the cyber physical world. We now do have an understanding that our activities in the digital world have physical implications and vice versa. And, I'm well known for saying that we will never find ourselves again a time when we will disconnect. We are increasingly connecting even as humans. We have now got, internet-enabled devices in our bodies. And so, this is something that is real and tangible and visceral. So the point of sovereignty, I think, is also up for grabs. I think that we're pushing the boundaries of what the definition of a modern conception of sovereignty is, both in terms of the physical world, but also in the virtual world, where we do see that collaboration is required to be able to push back against malicious cyber activity, but also as part of that to create a safer and more secure world for us to live in. And so sovereignty is needed in the traditional way of what we understand sovereignty to be, but I would also argue that we need to understand what sovereignty means when we collaborate with our trusted partners. And so for me, this report that Rajiv has written, as well as the way that ASPI conceives of the world around that, but then also the conversations in that onion ring coming out from the report, understands, I think, that we partner with people who we trust, whether that's in our personal lives, it's in our professional lives, it's between organisations, it's between countries. So what does trust actually mean in that equation? Sovereignty is part of how we assure trust. And so if we are going to partner as an individual or as a company or as a government agency or as a country with another sort of like entity or country on the other side of the fence, that we have a collective agreement is not a great person or entity or country to partner with. It undermines the trust in that collaboration. And so sovereign cyber capabilities are critical to making sure that we can point to what assurance means and what trust means in that whole equation. So to have now over 350 cybersecurity companies that we know at AustCyber to be fully Australian. And in the vetting process, we get asked about this all the time. How do we vet whether or not a company is Australian? There's a whole range of different things that we take account of in being able to answer that. It's not just about ownership. Ownership is really important, as the Minister pointed to. It's also about funding sources, which the Minister hinted at. But it's also the way in which the R&D process happens, the collaboration and the commercialisation process happens, and it's also how they sell into other markets. Whether that market happens to be Queensland because the technology was developed, or the service or the skills were developed in New South Wales, for example, or the ACT, but also offshore, how we do all of those things goes into what AustCyber considers to be sovereign. So it's a live debate, and I think that it comes at such an interesting time when we are asking for, as a country, for governments to reconsider what sovereignty means in procurement and in supply chains in a way that is evolved. It's not about protectionism, as the Minister talked about.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I'm going to pivot off that to talk on the point about trust. And we've had, Aidan, this is a question for you. We've had a major overhaul in a way that Australia goes about procuring cloud from a government perspective and certifying cloud. I was wondering, from your perspective, given that your company is involved in this space, how are those changes going to impact both from a security point of view and also from
Fergus again. Are you back with us, Fergus?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, could you just wind back 30 seconds?
Yeah, sorry. So given the changes on the secure cloud front, how do you think that those changes are going to impact the market from a security point of view and also from a competition point of view as a company that plays in that space?
Yeah, so I think the ACSC did a very good job in their industry consultation in the post-CCSL framework. And I think one of the key call-outs I'd make on this question of defining trust and as a part of the assurance piece is that the new framework clearly spells out the importance of all types of data that you need to secure. It's not just the underlying database. And it calls out real issues around supply chain, particularly where your supply chain is a follow the sun model. In other words, you have daytime support here in Australia, and after hours you may go to India, through Europe, and then back to the US, and then to Australia the next day. So I actually think what it does more than anything is it gives better clarity and transparency to the conversation. Because I think for a period of time there was a risk of there was nothing to see here. We were sort of trying to gloss over it as an industry. I think what we've got now is a real spotlight here to focus on what are the key elements around trust and assurance. The other point I'd make, Fergus, is we don't have to create our very first examples here. There are actually many blueprints the Australian government can follow. Clearly, ASD has created some very good frameworks with the ISM and PSPF. There's definitely some attributes or blueprints we can gather there, including Essential 8. DISP, which is Defence Industry, which Rajiv calls out in this piece of research, has got another model. He also calls out the UK Cyber Essentials. So there's actually many, many options available to align and have a consistent, coherent approach when it comes to defining what is assurance, what is trust when it comes to the cybersecurity piece. Clearly, sovereignty, which is one element, but obviously there are many others, including the technical piece, as well as the assurance and the auditing of it.
Well, let me turn to Rajiv then on this idea that you raised in the paper of having a simplified, smaller set of standards to improve market dynamics and try to reduce the cost of participating in these bids for companies. Can you walk us through at a top level what that would look like, Rajiv?
One of the challenges for businesses is there's lots of different requirements. You bid for one thing, you get asked to meet one set of requirements. You bid for another project with another department, you get another set of requirements to comply with. So simplifying that system is important, but also sort of right-sizing it is important. You know, you have some very good guidance produced by SSC, such as the ISM and the PSPF. Just remember, those were all written for government departments to follow. So if you just sort of pick them up and you say, you know, you want to join the DIS program, therefore you must comply with the Essential 8, that's actually quite tough for a small business to do. You know, if you go and look, the National Audit Office will tell you that many large government departments can't comply with it. So saying every SME needs to comply with it in order to get on the Defence Industry Security Programme is maybe not the best idea. So that idea of sort of right-sizing it, but then having a number of levels. You know, we have a basic level that small companies and every company really should qualify for. But then an ability for companies to show that they can move through that, through a level of maturity, and show that, you know, where they want to put the investment in and to use this security as a differentiator, they can do that, be recognised as doing so, and that can be taken into account in the procurement process. So to summarise, the key things are, you know, it's got to be realistic and sort of right-sized and really looking at the outcomes you want rather than maybe lots of prescriptive controls or policies required. And it's also got to be graduated. You know, not everyone has to go for the gold standard, but, you know, you can be a 1-star rating and at least get on the playing field. And if you want to make a name for yourself, you can aspire to a 5-star rating. It's got to cover that as well. And as Aidan says, I don't think we have to invent this ourselves. There are some good models around the world. We can look at the experiences of the UK and their Cyber Essentials scheme. I'm very interested to watch what the US is doing in rolling out their cyber maturity model certification process, the CMMC. You know, this is a chance where we can look at the experience of others, learn from it, and come up with something which works well in our environment.
And Michelle, from someone with their finger on the pulse for Australian emerging cybersecurity firms, are those sort of proposals going to benefit your constituents? Is that something that's going to help Australian companies, you know, the startups and SMEs?
I think it will, absolutely. I think, though, of course, because one of the points of difference between the Australian sort of culture of doing business relative to other parts of the world that we do often compare ourselves to and look to for cues is how much more conservative we are when it comes to the management of risk, but how much more willing we are to engage with risk when it comes to the application of technology. So this kind of tension that gets created in that means that as soon as somebody makes a mistake, everyone gets penalised. And that's not just the small companies. And so I think absolutely what Rajiv has said, I build on and say that what the Minister mentioned around focusing on medium-sized businesses within the Australian definition of what a mid-sized company is, and really looking to their recent experience of being small businesses themselves and how we can work in a coordinated way across that landscape to help small businesses step up in a facilitated way, leveraging the experience of the growth phases that middle-sized businesses have been through. Because, of course, we have seen small businesses within the DISP be compromised through cyber means, and that has called into question whether or not those companies can participate in the global supply chain program available through, you know, defence industry. And that's just one of many, many, many examples that we've got available to us in recent history. So I think that in recognising that ultimately the management of cybersecurity within organisations, within supply chains is a risk challenge. It's not a compliance challenge, yet we are applying a compliance mindset to it, means that we have to accept some failure. But where will we be willing to accept failure? And I think that it's not good enough to just sort of push the risk down the food chain, if you like. That we actually need to help people understand what this new cyber physical world means from a business management and risk management perspective. And I include government agencies in that. I think that, you know, pointing out, as Rajiv has, that, you know, we do have a range of, you know, government agencies at all levels of government that are not performing themselves, means that we also have to help them too. And, you know, we can do that. We can actually do that. We just have to recognise, I think, from a cultural point of view, that there are some long-standing misperceptions that need to be overcome in all of this. Our startups are still here. They have not disappeared. Out of the 350 companies that AustCyber works with, we have lost one in the last 4 years. And during COVID, all of them are hanging on. Some of them are having to hold on with their nails, but they are hanging on. We haven't seen any other than one company disappear. They are still here. We have to crack through some of these old misperceptions.
That's great. Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to turn to some of our many audience questions that are coming in, and I'll do an approximation of democracy by choosing some of them that have been highly upvoted and selectively choosing some others as well. But we've got a question here from Mike about how sovereign, Mike Walkington, how sovereign will our capability be when almost all our hardware components will need to be imported? Do you want to take that one, Michelle?
I've been eyeing off that question. Thanks for raising it, Fergus, and a great question, Mike. And so it's all about the economics. Australia really does have some significantly globally competitive smarts when it comes to component manufacture, and we are doing it through supply chains in defence industry. There's some fantastic companies around Australia that are providing componentry of the kinds that we need to make electronica. We also have some that are emerging in the space industry. Some of them are being shared, but that sort of focus that the government has had, and governments plural, in the last couple of years around rebooting advanced manufacturing. Let's be very clear here. It is about advanced and additive manufacturing, as well as looking at what we can be globally competitive in around general manufacturing like food. That we do have the ability to be able to regenerate a componentry manufacturing industry in Australia. But I would say that our greatest sort of benefit in doing so would be to focus on those niche capabilities that we need around electronic componentry. And so once upon a time, we really did have a thriving industry. It's just that we didn't know about it. And all of those companies were only engaged in exporting, and then they got acquired. We can reshore that. We can bring that back onshore again. And I think there is now the economics available to us to make that work. We've just got to choose to do it from a seed funding perspective to kick it off. And then everyone will pile in. When we imagine this world that we're currently in, where we're not able to access different parts of the supply chain because it is literally cut off by air and sea, we can use these circumstances to demonstrate that even if we didn't have a pandemic on our hands cutting off those supply lines, we can compete globally in some of that componentry manufacture. But to the point that the question that Mike's asking, right now, that is a problem. There's no two ways about it. The economics don't work to test every single device coming into the country. And so we have to accept some risk. And of course, in some places, that risk is actually quite high. It's not talked about publicly, but we do have to deal with it. So I think that let's continue the conversation about that. Let's get loud about that, because unless we do, no one's going to do anything about it. I would love to be able to see that happen, and I'll do what I can at AustCyber to make it happen.
Great. We've got a highly upvoted question from Shangan, which says, how exactly do the panelists intend to use government procurement processes to improve cybersecurity of supply chains? Will it be through imposing regulation, and if so, what kind? So I'm going to throw that to you, Rajiv, and I don't know if Aidan and Michelle want to jump in afterwards, but why don't you kick us off?
So it's through a combination of regulation and encouragement, I think, is what it needs to be. On the one hand, there needs to be regulation that says what the expectations are, how these things can be done, how are we going to measure this. But the other half, it has to be encouragement. And this comes back to the leveraging of procurement. There's all that money that government's spending. What it needs to do is it needs to make sure that when it makes decisions about where to spend that, it encourages and rewards people to make that investment in better security. So we don't just take the cheapest solution. If someone puts the investment in, provides better security that uplifts all of us, then that's given an advantage. That's given a preference. So we should make it, if we'd rather spend $1 there than on someone that hasn't put that investment in. So it has to be both sides of the coin. Yes, regulation, but let's use economic levers and encouragement, carrot and stick.
Aidan, do you want to chime in on this one?
Yes, no, thank you. Thank you, Fergus. I should say I've lost audio of Rajiv and Michelle, so apologies if I'm repeating them. I think the key here is if you embedded in procurement that $10 billion at the Commonwealth level, the $3 billion of ICT spend in New South Wales, you provide a commercial incentive for businesses to invest in cybersecurity. That is ultimately what we're trying to drive. How do we, to come back to this question, is we need to embed an assessment on cybersecurity into that value for money assessment. We're doing cost or price, we're doing quality, we're doing timelines. We need to add cybersecurity. But for that to happen, we first of all need a benchmark to compare it against. right? And in my earlier question, I sort of said there's quite a few benchmarks that we can use. The key is for it to be consistent. It's one set of benchmarks, but one set doesn't mean it's not graduating. We just don't want to look at different rules for the federal versus each state and maybe even local government. There needs to be one set, but there could be different levels, which is exactly what the defence industry has done. They have a 4-tier system, if I'm correct, so that if you're starting out, you could do the very basics, get to level 0, right through if you're building naval ships, you might need to get to the very top level, level 4.
Michelle, did you want to add anything on that point?
I upvote everything that Aidan and Rajiv said on that one.
Excellent. So we've got a question here from Christian. How was the success of the CREST Small Business grants measured, and what was the outcome? Is that going to be a question for you, Michelle?
Maybe, and I don't want to put words in the mouth of the Minister or the Department because, as colleagues know, we are not government. It's a great question, and I believe that a report is not far away on that particular program because, of course, it has now terminated with the release of the 2020 strategy. So, my strategy is now put to bed. It's now in history. I think that, we should be asking questions about that program. I think now that the 2020 strategy has been released, I'm happy to come clean on on aspects of the 2016 strategy. That was an initiative that I did not support as one of the significant contributors to the development of that strategy. And as some people know, I actually physically wrote that strategy. And so that was a really vexed one. And it was not something that actually came to pass easily within government either. It was an unusual way to try and make a start on how we help smaller businesses understand cybersecurity. And of course, it's one that ultimately hasn't worked in my view. But I think that there are some learnings that we can take from the way that that program was designed, but also then operated. I think the basic principle of the program is still valid. That having pen testing is something that's a valid tool, but it should not be the only tool. And of course, the second part to the equation was never responded to around, if you've received a report from a pen tester, well, what do you do next? And where are the funds to help businesses be able to absorb what they need to do next? When they didn't really have any means to understand what cyber risk meant to their business. So it's a really, really good question. And I think it's a question that we should continue to ask of government as to where the outcomes report is from that program, because I'm not sure where it's up to, but yeah.
So one of the recommendations that Rajiv has in his report, and I haven't seen it come up yet in our questions from our audience members, but it was around the idea of having mandatory cybersecurity insurance for suppliers to government as a way of starting to price risk and to reward firms with better cybersecurity and to sort of grow that market and create sort of assurance and a more level playing field between the bigger and the smaller players. I was wondering, this is really to all the panelists, but I guess we've got different perspectives here. Could Aidan and Michelle, how do you think that would affect industry from your point of view, and would that be a good measure to institute? Maybe start with you, Aidan, if that's all right.
Look, I think insurance is part of the equation. Clearly, there is no sector better than the insurance sector to price risk. That is effectively what the industry does. And so I think there's some very good policy cues on that pricing piece. The challenge is for any business that has looked into cyber security insurance, because it's a developing market, there's lots of carve-outs. It hasn't got to the level of maturity that Rajiv refers to when we think about our home security, where we clearly know that you can reduce premiums if you add locks and alarms and the like. It hasn't got there. And in part because the losses are very, very significant, particularly around the issues of phishing. So I think it does two things. One is it helps us to understand the magnitude of the risk. The second piece is it does allow us to insure for the residual risk. But we don't want to be reliant on it. The worst thing possible would be for a company to say, well, I've got insurance, therefore I don't care. because assurance happens after the event, right? The damage has happened, it's just the recovery. So I sort of go is, it has a part to play, but we shouldn't overestimate it right now. Over to you, Michelle.
Yeah, I agree, Aidan. I think that one of the ways that we can help this part of the market develop in a helpful and constructive way, because of course, to your point, what we want to be doing is working on the prevention side of the equation, because of the knock-on effect of interconnected systems and data and infrastructure. We would actually much prefer to be dealing with anticipatory cyber attack than having to kind of clean up afterwards, and relying therefore on insurance to help us do the mop up and all of the different issues that happen, both physically and emotionally, that happen after that. And do not ever get me wrong on this. To go through a cyber attack, no matter what size business you are, no matter what type of organisation you are, is a traumatic experience. It really is. It's much the same in that way as if your house burns down, or if the once in a century flood comes through, or there's a pandemic. So for me, it is actually also about the incentives that we put into that market. It's the incentives around the types of behaviours that get rewarded, to Rajiv's point earlier about sort of making sure that the system rewards great outcomes. But also, I think we can be using things like cyber insurance to reward great behaviour. And that's where I think, really have an opportunity to be able to reshape this necessary relationship between risk and compliance. And I noted that there's a question from the audience around risk as well, sort of to move away from this compliance mindset where we just tick the box and move on, as opposed to really actively engaging with the landscape that we're operating in and taking account of today's context and trying to guess what tomorrow's context is. So if we get those incentives right around this very emerging, developing space of cyber insurance to being used as a lever to incentivise good behaviours, I think is a really exciting one. But again, we have to help those insurers understand what that can look like. It's such a complex and dynamic space. It can't just be achieved by one. It has to be a collaboration.
Rajiv, do you want to have a weigh in on this?
I just say, I'm not saying it's a golden bullet. Absolutely not. What I think is it is a key ingredient, and if we can get cyber insurance market working better, it will help everyone, not just in terms of having something there to recover out of the fat, but in terms of encouraging the right risk management approach. And therefore, the idea of actually trying to mandate the take-up. One of the problems with cyber insurance at the moment is that the lack of take-up. And almost, if you're an insurer and someone comes and asks you to underwrite them, you think, well, why are they the person coming to me and not someone else? Why is the market self-selecting? If we can build that critical mass and breadth of coverage in the insurance market, we can get it to work much better. But, I'd agree with what both the presenters say. Firstly, it's not a golden bullet. I'd definitely say that. The other thing is, it is part of getting people to consider risk up front, not just being able to sit back and say, well, I'm insured, I don't worry, I can set fire to my house, it doesn't matter if it burns down. So we need to do that, because, risk is where we need to be. The problem is risk is really difficult, for professionals. Trying to evaluate and manage risk is hard work. For, your everyday business person on the street, trying to understand and quantify risk is almost impossible. And therefore we can find people whose job it is to know how to do that. They can help people to make the right risk decisions.
Well, Mark has asked a very popular question, which is, who is conducting these assurance activities? What is the process for becoming an accredited service provider? Is that something you want to take, Michelle, or is there Rajiv?
So I think that's still being determined. And I think, if you look in my report, it's one of the things I said, we need to actually find a good solution to this. The problem is, we talked about changes to the cloud services list. One of the problems there was we had a bottleneck, which was there was a small group of people within ACSC who had to approve everything. And of course, they got overwhelmed with all these companies coming to them saying, can you please approve this? And therefore that process ground to a halt and it had to be changed. I agree, there's been some good moves in trying to overcome that bottleneck and some good industry consultation around that, how that happens. What we need to do is we need to scale up a group of people that we can trust. Relying on companies to self-certify themselves is not going to build trust across anywhere. What we need is, having independent certifiers, but with an organisation such as the ACC providing that quality assurance and backup, so they, if you like, can train the assessors and they can regularly assess the work of the assessors to make sure that people are applying a common benchmark and a consistent standard across there. But yeah, this, we need to find a way of scaling out, and we can't just scale out by saying, it has to be someone sitting in the ACSC that has to sign off individually in every single assessment.
And I'll just add to that by saying that I think that it's also recognising that the ACSC literally can't be all things to all people. And we know through the passage of time, it's a comparatively short period of time that the ACSC has been around. It was following the 2011 National Security Statement of then Prime Minister Gillard that we saw the ACSC sort of start to emerge as a co-location of agencies, and now it's obviously been formalised in the way that it has. And I think that, quite seriously, if you're sitting in the sort of retail environment of the Australian economy, and for argument's sake, you own 5 or 6 Zambrero stores, are you going to be thinking about the ACSC as providing assurance to you around the inputs to your business from a cybersecurity point of view? You're probably trusting that somebody somewhere has given some thought to it, but you as a franchise owner will not be engaging with the ACSC, just straight up you won't be. And so I think that it's recognising that that function that the ACSC necessarily should be playing in providing that trusted assurance could actually be expanded out to a trusted group of government and industry people that has all of those necessary governance requirements put around it. But a collaboration of that kind, I think, steps things forward. It's not of our culture at the moment, but I think it needs to be. It's partly why there is success in the UK system and not just in cybersecurity. In other parts of emerging technology where there is a transparent public-private partnership around providing assurance, both of technical and non-technical kinds, you really start to see industry flourish, but also government agencies benefiting from that kind of capability outcome that happens from a collaboration of that nature. It takes time, but we have to move in that direction, in my view.
So we're coming up to the end of the session, the top of the hour, and I was just going to ask each of the panelists for their final sort of view on if government is going to leverage this $10 billion spend to both improve cybersecurity and advance the national interests. What's your top recommendation, or what would you most like to see government do to leverage that and harness that enormous power that it has? And maybe I'll start with you, Rajiv, and then we'll go to Michelle and Aidan, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I mean, my top level would be, as someone who's worked in the security industry for many years, what I would say, a lot of our problems we come from a technical point of view is because we didn't consider security integral to everything else that we did. And so my parting message from today to everyone would be, let's make sure we don't repeat the mistake with government procurement. Security should be integral to every government procurement decision that's made. So every time there's a procurement made, every time there's a tender decision made, someone should be asking the question, what do we think about security here? Did we pick the most secure solution? Are we getting the best value for money? Not just in terms of the capability but what is the economic benefit creating? What is the security benefit of what we're procuring? It should always be a question we ask.
Hear, hear. And then I'll add to that by saying, in that kind of an approach, having that kind of culture, not just happening within government agencies, but also within the large corporates in the country, imagine how much we will unlock, not just in terms of economic benefit, but also our strategic positioning internationally. And so I'd also ask listeners and viewers to go and have a look at AustCyber's submission to the cybersecurity strategy process, where we talk about a procurement sandbox. We actually think that this is the best concept to be able to start to move the needle on the conception of risk, enable SMEs to be a part of the equation, be able to start educating SMEs on how to be part of larger situations where they can actually form their own consortia and have a prime sitting in front of them that is an SME as well, but also to be able to have far better articulation of what the problem sets are that we are trying to solve, where we're trying to engage as a nation in emerging technologies, with cyber being included in that, but also needing to be an enabler of all other emerging technologies. That concept, which of course Rajiv has mentioned within the report, would be a game changer to build on that culture, that that awesome utopian picture that Rajiv's just painting for us. Aidan.
Thank you. Look, my comments would be to simply comment on, first of all, that we have clear leadership being called out here from the Prime Minister down, that cybersecurity sovereign capabilities and skills are absolutely crucial. We've heard that and seen it being replicated at the state level. So there is no shortage of government direction at all levels. The challenge now is, how do we operationalise those clear directives? And how do we operationalise it at COVID speeds? We need the jobs, we need the cybersecurity posture. The most tangible way to do that is to embed it into the procurement assessment framework that underpins the $10 billion of ICT spent at the federal level, $3.5 billion or so at New South Wales, and somewhat similar numbers at the other states. And it's all about, how do we do that quickly? How do we operationalise that fast? It's no longer a time for more consultations, more consultants, more thinking about it. We need the jobs now. We need the cybersecurity posture now. We need the sovereign skills and capability now. That's the challenge, and to be honest, a great opportunity for the nation. They're my comments. Fergus, back to you.
Thank you very much, Aidan, Michelle, and Rajiv. Rajiv, thank you for investing the time to write this report and spur this conversation. Thank you, Aidan and Michelle, for your time today and joining us as panelists. Thank you to the Minister for joining us and speaking and sticking around. And I want to especially thank Macquarie Government and Aidan for making this research possible. It is very hard to support good original research, and we really have valued the partnership and the thought leadership that your company constantly shows in this space. So thank you very much for that. And it's a wonderful partnership. And have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Sarah?
Thank you.